Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and some of you responded really positively to my last video talking about men's issues and how to solve them through a combination of public policy and societal change. My hypothesis is that for those born as male, especially those who are under 40 right now especially, the expectations of manhood have become less attainable each generation of potential men since the Industrial Revolution. In America, but also in other industrialized nations as well. This increasing inability to achieve the basic modern premise of manhood, being a financial provider, has led to a crisis of confidence that has led not only to outbursts of negative behavior, commonly referred to as toxic masculinity, but also, and perhaps even more dominantly, each generation of males sees more and more of them opting out of the workforce. However, the largest traditional contributor to a man's social circle has typically been his career. So it may be no surprise that the final stage of behavior here is social withdrawal, but also addiction. And not just chemical addiction, but often media internet addictions as well. Whatever can occupy the time not spent in the workplace or in social outings. Life can be a very long time if you're all alone. The quality of jobs has more or less steadily decreased over time, with one exception having been in the heart of the New Deal era. Simultaneously, women went from terrible job prospects to getting better and better each generation because of advancing women's rights. The overall jobs and wage quality decreasing wasn't as big a deal as finally earning as much as their male peers, even if their male peers were earning less than they were a generation ago. So in a way, this decrease was only really apparent to men, and most impactful to them because of their previously privileged position, whereas women came from a place of little privilege, so any access, any progress broadened their horizons relative to what they started with. But this is also definitely a two Americas issue. If you look at the averages, men are still doing better than women. But then you remember that an average of men's wages would be enormously skewed by Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates, among many other men who make so much per hour that they could pay many a man's annual wages. Whereas with fewer female CEOs, more women make closer to the average than is the case for men. Looking at men under 40 specifically, you'll see that women of their generation are on average making more than them, as well as being more likely to be employed overall. And when you look at the lower social classes, this effect becomes even more abundantly clear. To put it bluntly, old rich men are doing very well, whereas poor young men are being left behind by society. One group has enormous power to control society. The other group feels as if they have no power or impact on society at all, let alone really having much agency even in their own lives, despite being far more numerous of a group. It can be easy to look at the numbers of this and draw causation from those correlations, to treat the workplace as a zero-sum game and say that women's job prospects increase at the cost of men's. But this isn't the case, or at least not entirely. Women entering the workplace made two-income households more common, and employers took advantage of this fact to lower worker pay without immediately destroying household income. It was like a steel trap that closed around families, locking both parents into the workplace just to be able to feed their kids. And this allowed productivity to sharply rise in the 20th century as everyone entered the workforce, while worker pay couldn't even keep up with inflation in some cases. But make no mistake, this isn't the fault of women. It's the fault of the companies who cut our grandfathers' pay, and cut our fathers' pay, and now offer us least of all. And as women are increasingly breaking through the glass ceilings, they're also going to start to realize that the ceiling is slowly coming down for the majority of people. And that includes them as well. Again, they just haven't noticed the loss of worker power because, previous generations of women didn't really have any worker power at all. So it feels like they've improved their standing. Because they have. With all of that out of the way, the next thing I want to acknowledge here is the huge intersectionality of this issue. black men, for instance, have different barriers to social or employment opportunities, as well as a greater intersection with some other issues that I'll mention later that compound the issues of men who drop out of the workforce. One strong intersection that I've already covered is the alienation and isolation that many in the American disability system face. And disability is one of the many reasons that men opt out of the workforce, or at least one of the ways that that becomes possible. And I'll link to that video in the description because in some ways, it's very clear that I'm talking about a population that has essentially had some of the same negative effects that I'm describing here for men. You really should watch that video. I don't have time to get into it here because it's a really particular case of alienation. And, you know, if you're interested in the intersection between men's issues and disability related issues, then check that video out. Again, I don't think I could do that justice in a soundbite. But what's also worth saying here is that mental health, even if it's not enough to get you a disability, often plays a cyclical role in this process. Men's health issues, especially untreated ones, often lead to a degradation of both the social and employment spheres of the people who face them. But as many of you know, the reality is that good jobs are decided often by who you know. So even a diligent worker with social setbacks will have difficulty rising in the ranks, reinforcing a low-class status that in turn hurts social opportunities, which decrease job performance and so on. This is something that can actually become a very real slippery slope into socioeconomic withdrawal for men who face them. And let's face it, it's easy to tell someone to get therapy. But in this case, unless you or a family member of theirs is going to pay for that therapy, that man probably won't be able to afford it. At which point, you're basically just talking down to them for being poor. For this generation of down-on-their-luck men, without access to affordable and often free healthcare, you may as well spit in his face. There's also the fact that men generally have worse outcomes at every step of the criminal justice ladder than women. From likelihood to have a police encounter to begin with, to likelihood of being arrested in that encounter, likelihood of facing more severe charges, being found guilty in court, having longer sentences when convicted than their female counterparts. And of course, if you're not a white man, every one of those issues is further compounded by race. I'm not saying that like white men do worse in court than black women, but that you'd notice a distinct difference in these metrics between, say, black men and black women. Though the amount of this legal prejudice is probably not as profound as, say, racial prejudice, but it does exist, and it is especially felt by already marginalized communities, especially when we're talking about things like violent crime, as men are typically seen to be more violent than women in society. But additionally, there's also a much stronger prejudice towards that way of thinking about black men in particular. And then once you've been introduced to the criminal justice system, now you'll end up with a record that is going to keep you from getting gainful employment, which is also going to lead you perhaps back into crime, back into police custody, and then there's just a number of negative spirals happening as a result of what we do to people through the criminal justice system that disproportionately affect men instead of women, that keep them out of gainful employment even after they get out of the system, and often social circles as well. In many localities, they even drain what little money they might be able to make legitimately through extensive probation fees and things of the sort because, because some places you can really tell that they're running the whole city budget on speeding tickets and, nickel and diming the criminally poor. The LGBT community actually has some overlap here. After all, I still know little boys in my family who say gay like it's the peak insult to use to question the masculinity of another boy. But actually, the LGBT community tends to have the advantage of community, which can short-circuit the isolation spiral. That being said, especially if you live somewhere very red, the LGBT identity can make things a lot more difficult, at least in the way of feeling acceptance within your community. And if your only friends are online queers, you may end up feeling pretty isolated in your real life still, kind of using the internet as an escape, which again is kind of one of the hallmarks of this behavior spiral. That being said, LGBT black men, especially black trans women, have a lot of trouble fitting into their communities and can often be subject to violence at higher rates than other LGBT groups. This is a complex issue, and I'm probably of the wrong life experiences to be able to explain what's happening here, but I understand that it's one of the unique complexities of being assigned black and male at birth. These particular exceptions bring into focus one of the ways in which some of this might be mitigated, which is through positive communities. And I have a couple that were recommended to me in the comments of the previous video, so I'll link those in the description if people want to check in on those online communities. But at the end of the day, so long as there's still only online communities, there's only so much that they can really do to help other men. One thing that might be especially helpful here is a sort of men's group that operates locally and has the same type of ethos and vibe of a lot of the men's liberation groups I'm linking to in the description, in the way that they all seem to be pushing towards a positive redefinition of masculinity. Because having physical groups within the community where men can meet face to face and meet people that they can go out and do things with, and that they can, this actually gives them much more of an ability to literally take their hand and pull them out of this negative spiral. You could structure them perhaps a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you enter the group and you get a sponsor who checks on you and reminds you not to isolate, who helps you with goals and places that you might be struggling to reach your dreams, like a mentor. And the group in general can be about how we positively advance our lives in a similar way that people in Alcoholics Anonymous are trying to discover ways that they can move away from alcoholism. This group could try to help move men away from self-isolation. But given the other issues, we do need solutions that make mental health available for everyone, no matter how little money they have to pay for it. We need to completely reimagine our criminal justice system to be less aggressive in putting people into the system to begin with, while also changing that system to be reconstructive instead of being punitive and often actually deconstructive. We need to limit the amount of disclosure of criminal records that can be required by employers. There will have to be some exceptions. I would imagine that, keeping sex offenders out of schools, for instance, might be important. But for the most part, employers shouldn't have so much leeway to require a disclosure of criminal history. We have to accept that limiting the employment opportunities of former criminals will just lead to higher rates of recidivism. And I'm not exactly sure how to do this, but maybe only letting them look back for a window of 1 or 2 years, or maybe only letting them see felonies or something like that, or maybe only letting them see felonies that occurred within the last 10 years or something, so that even felons have, a time when they can return to normal society. And maybe even 10 years is too much. Maybe it should be decided by the felony, Maybe we should have an automatic expungement system if someone keeps their record clean after their last... there's a lot of ways that this could be dealt with, but I think that the easiest one is really changing the way that employers are able to look at people's criminal records. And this is in addition to some of the solutions that I discussed before, such as moving the minimum wage closer to a place where it could support an entire family on that single income, but also provided guaranteed government jobs with a decent income to the men, and honestly also women. There's no reason that this has to be specifically tailored to men. It could also be guaranteed jobs for women as well, just so long as those men have a guaranteed opportunity. I don't care if women are also getting some of these jobs too, you know what I mean? Why not? But also that we need a men's movement that's not focused on rights, because we're not at a deficit of rights compared to women, but in other respects that takes some of the tools and methods that were laid down by feminism in our past and reappropriates them for use in remodeling and reimagining masculinity itself, which it seems that there are actually a number of people who are actively putting in that work, especially on the left, and maybe even most sincerely on the left, because people on the right don't seem to want to reimagine masculinity so much as they want to have grievances about society. I don't know. I just don't feel like there's any real answers coming from that side. And this script is already getting long, but I do want to mention here that there are also some issues in which women are disproportionately affected, such as domestic violence. But the minority of men suffering from this issue usually have little or nothing in the way of community support. Whereas, I spent a few months of my childhood in a battered women's shelter with my mother when she was getting away from my dad. But even if men don't face problems like this as often as women, that doesn't mean that men don't need support in this area at all. Without taking a moment to mention more specific issues like this, there are a number of issues where the people affected are split into something like 80% women and 20% men. But in those cases, you'll often find that there are organizations helping women specifically, but few that offer that same help to men as well. Meaning that 20% of men who face the same issue often have significantly more trouble finding support. And to answer the myth that the left never really talks about men's issues, we do, but I can see how you might get that impression. And it's mainly because there isn't anyone on the left who's really grifting on these issues the same way as the right does. A lot of us definitely talk about these things, but there isn't, say, a left-wing Jordan Peterson who's both highly visible and primarily talks about men's issues. A lot of people often note Jordan Peterson on the right as a good or even bad example of this, and I think that he's kind of both, in that if you strip away everything that he says and all of his political views from his books, then it's basically just run-of-the-mill self-help. And for the kind of people who've hit rock bottom like we're describing here, that will likely make some really helpful takeaways from just a book full of basic self-help stuff. The problem is also framing it in an anti-feminist right-wing perspective, which has to ignore a lot of the issues that I've mentioned so far in these two videos, and also kind of handcuffs in their ability to address them. So really, if we're being completely honest, the best thing that the right has going for them is pretty much some basic self-help advice that, honestly, I don't think many of us would necessarily disagree with. I mean, I generally do feel better in a clean room. That's just kind of a basic psychological thing that works for most people. It's also a good reason to clean your room if you want to feel a little bit better. But that's not profound, and Peterson is far from the first person to suggest it either. And if all of these things really just emphasize personal responsibility, emphasize the idea that you're doing something wrong, that something is wrong with you. And whereas I think that the way that I see it as a combination of giving people access to the resources that they need that they weren't able to access previously to allow them to make up for the deficiencies that they may currently have. Because I think that most people in this situation really want a way out. They want a life raft or someone who will listen to them and take them seriously, and not just laugh at them. And someone who will do the bit of work that it takes to reach out and break them out of this spiral. And to be fair, the right has put a lot of work into building communities that specifically target this demographic. However, I just don't believe that what they're loading them up with ideologically is well equipped to understand the problems that they face or the solutions that could get them out of it. Instead, I think that, especially within the incel community and a lot of other MRA groups, it also leads to more of a doom spiral because they don't help the men get the tools that they need to get out of this. Instead, they just target the vulnerable and shepherd them into ideologically transformative communities because they know that they don't really have a life and spend all their time online anyways, so why not just load them up with propaganda? I mean, honestly, it's a very 2010s grift. You notice a population that feels unheard within society. You write a book that's basically just a regurgitation of things that people have been saying in the self-help genre since it started like 100 years ago. And then just started to throw in a little bit of political ideology that ends up in the worship from these communities and builds a whole sphere of intellectual dark web around you, which you can milk for profit and donations. By giving them this basic copy pasta self-help they probably need and would get better personalized to them in the therapy that they aren't getting, they create a hook by which to radicalize them. But you should realize that not all or probably even most of the people who fit this bill, even to this day, are radical men's rights activists. And yet, often, when a man reveals his own isolation and loneliness, not only do some people not reach back out, but some assume that they're secretly an MRA weirdo and shun them. As a commenter on my original video put it, I know some of you might be sick of dealing with lonely men online, but they live in a difficult circumstance that only gets darker until someone is willing to reach out, pull them to the light. So who will it be that reaches out to them? Will it be us? Or just another hand with a red pill? Thank you all for sticking around. If you appreciate this content, please like, subscribe, do all that YouTube shit that I should probably be reminding you to do like 30 seconds into the video. But if you stuck around, I'm pretty sure you're going to do it. I mean, you watched this whole thing. And if you're still here, even after I said that dumb shit, you'll probably appreciate these links on the screen where you can send me money and support. And I would really appreciate it. You can either send like a monthly donation of $1 or maybe just send me $3 for a cup of coffee today. Either way, I greatly appreciate it, and all the support that you gives me just helps me keep doing this. So if you appreciate me doing this, help me build my own intrinsic motivation to do so by subscribing to the channel and maybe sending me $1 on coffee. No matter what you decide to do, I appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video anyways, and I hope you have a great day.